Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at mangit@useanvil.com. That's MANGGIT@useanvil.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Build vs. Buy podcast. I'm your host, Mangit Ng, founder and CEO of Anvil, the fastest way to build software for documents. And today, as my guest, I have Shitesh Grover. He is the founder and CTO at Orb, and it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And so maybe to get started, would love to get a quick background on yourself, starting from whenever you want. Maybe some people start from their childhood, other people start with their professional career, and then would love to learn a little bit more about Orb. I think what Orb's doing is really interesting, so would love for you to share.
Yeah, I'll just start with my professional career. So was at Asana for a few years, working on product and a lot of infrastructure. So working on the kind of core reactivity service that powered a lot of the business logic at Asana. And now, of course, working on Orb. I am currently the CTO at Orb and one of the founders. So have been working on Orb for about 3.5 years. Orb is a usage-based billing platform. So we help other companies keep track of their billing, their invoicing, and we help them generate those invoices for their customers, as well as do a bunch of financial reporting and alerting and a whole ecosystem of tools that surround their monetization strategy. As I said, we focus on usage-based billing, which means there's some element of dynamic spend to your pricing. Obviously, this is super common in AI now. We work with a ton of different companies that bill on some sort of dynamic usage metric. So it ranges from obviously AI now, where companies that we work with like Perplexity or Pinecone, they're charging for API requests or storage or compute. And then in the data developer tooling, cloud infrastructure space, companies like Vercel and Replit that are hosting platforms or other developers are building on top of them. And they're charging those developers for, again, something like compute or requests or some processing metric, right? So yeah, it's been really fun to build in the space, and I think there's a ton of new companies that are forming that will have some sort of either usage-based pay-as-you-go model or some hybrid of a platform subscription seat along with usage-based components in their pricing.
Yeah, totally. I feel like the usage-based billing and subscription model has really blown up in the past couple of years. And can you tell me a little bit more about how you got started in this space? In this, how did you come up with Orb and the idea for Orb?
Yeah, so Alvaro, Orb CEO, and myself, the two co-founders, we were both at Asana, and Asana struggled to some extent with monetization, just in the sense of there were a lot of monetization and billing related initiatives at the company. There was a fairly large engineering team surrounding the effort, and I think seeing that and coming away from that, we knew that monetization was a interesting space where it was really high ROI, but lots of engineering bandwidth involved. And Asana had a very successful journey going from when we were there fairly small to direct listing. So it paid off for the company, but did have to staff a lot of engineering and finance and operations bandwidth on it. So that was the seed for focusing on monetization. And then when we started talking to, at the time, companies like Plaid and Twilio, who had been doing some sort of usage-based model for a long time, we realized that there was the billing component, which has always been true, promotions and discounting and upgrades, downgrades, but also the data infrastructure component, right? Yeah. Where you have to build and maintain some pretty significant infrastructure, where they were basically having to rebuild billing from scratch themselves. And we realized that this was a good opportunity because we really think these hybrid models are here to stay. And yeah, we got excited. I particularly got excited about building more of the data infrastructure stack because that's always been my technical interest. Yeah, that's how we started.
That's super interesting. I feel like I've been at a couple companies at this point, and every time, just like to echo your experience at Asana, there always seems to be a pretty large billing team to just manage the various types of billing. At Dropbox, it was an entire team.
Yeah.
At Dialpad, when I was there, it was small, but it was like one out of, I think, 6 engineers that was just focused on integrating Braintree at the time for payments and collecting money from our customers.
And you can think of it as basically a tax on the industry where you as a company want to spend ideally all of your headcount R&D and otherwise on launching new features and going to market, but obviously you have to collect on that innovation and make money some way, and you end up needing to staff some team or another for that effort. And the idea behind Orb is to minimize the amount you need to be spending on collecting money and billing your customers and more on just building the product. So yeah, I totally resonate with that. I think lots of companies are still spending far too much time. And honestly, even with that investment, they don't change their pricing a lot, right? There's a lot of fear and uncertainty around doing that. And so what you end up having is this idea where you spend a year or 2 years or 5 years really making the product a lot better. And then that happens incrementally, whereas only at the end of that ramp do you change pricing. And now you're in a situation where, of course, people are going to be surprised and complain because it's a big step jump. And so I just think, despite the investment, pricing isn't really treated as iteratively as it should be. It evolves in these pretty harsh jumps, which is not great for customers or the business.
Yeah, the amount of effort it takes to change pricing it effectively disincentivizes companies to try out new models, to update it over time as new features and more value is being created
Yeah.
by your product. And I feel like this podcast is you're uniquely positioned for this podcast because this is one of those like super high value, high ROI, as you called it, engineering efforts, as well as finance and operations that is effectively required to run a business, right? Especially a
Yeah.
software business. But it is also just not the core of what you're trying to build. Anvil builds paperwork software. We're not trying to build billing software.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a stupid question, and it's probably a stupid question. You can tell me if it is. How do you guys differ from Stripe? Stripe came in and was like, hey, we'll handle all of your payments for you.
Yeah.
But then there's a whole layer of these companies that are doing usage-based billing
Yeah.
that you would think Stripe would just be able to do. But well, yeah, how do you guys differ?
Yeah, so Stripe has a few different products in their suite, right? So there's obviously the kind of core moneymaker business driver of payments. So everyone knows about the you submit your credit card on a Stripe form, Stripe processes your payments. And then on top of that, Stripe has Stripe invoicing and Stripe billing. So billing is the directly competitive product to Orb, where we are a billing engine, and we still integrate with Stripe for the payments piece.
Okay.
There's still a question, like you said, and certainly not a silly or trivial one around why is Orb's billing engine different than Stripe's billing engine, given that they also participate in the subscription stack. And I think the answer is they're different starting points, right? So Stripe subscriptions started for the seat-based businesses where there is some complexity in the billing domain, as we were just talking about. There's all the like time zones and proration sort of complexity, upgrades, downgrades. But the surrounding stuff is a lot simpler. Like when you have a seat-based subscription, maybe you're adding and removing seats. Maybe you're going from one phase of your price schedule to another. But in these usage-based businesses, thinking about aggregating a ton of usage data really flexibly is just not something you have to think about in seats. Thinking about adding usage-based add-ons and how do they capture existing usage that's been sent, not something you have to think about when you're building for seats. And just there's a lot more complexity that can happen over the course of a subscription that means that the product needs to be architected pretty differently. One good example of this is in a lot of these subscription tools, you only see an invoice at the end of the month. And that's because it's like a fixed quantity thing. Whereas with Orb, there's always a draft invoice because your usage is accruing in the middle of the month and you need to know. It's July 23rd today, for example. How much has my customer spent in the last 23 days? And I need to track that. I need to set up alerting on that. And those are the sorts of considerations that I think you don't build for when you're catering towards a more static sort of a PDF with 3 line items and a quantity sort of interface.
Man, I feel like we could talk about usage-based billing for this entire podcast. We've certainly run into our own challenges with implementing usage-based billing on Anvil, and so many horror stories there. I feel like it takes us every time we want to do a pricing change, it takes more time than anybody would like. And but like just a kind of quick note on this, I feel like when when Slack came out, they really took billing and how they meter and charge for Slack as a
Yeah.
competitive advantage. And
Yeah.
in some ways, that's become the norm. For those who might not know Slack's billing model, they essentially prorate and let you pay less if you have less active on your Slack kind of channel, and that's become and it's pretty much automated. And not very many
Yeah.
people were doing that back in the day. Um,
Yeah.
so is part of Orb's mission to effectively level the playing field here in some way? Or maybe this is just the future and everybody has to kind of
Hmm.
like be batting at that average.
The way I think about it is like we don't want to and don't attach ourselves to any particular billing model. I think even pay as you go usage based billing, that's not a particular billing model. In reality, every company, they might have a pay as you go tier, but they do minimum commitments and prepaid drawdowns, and they do all sorts of things at scale because they have to cater to different audiences. But the Slack example is an interesting one. I think um, in some ways that is a better representation, a more efficient representation of the value. Right? If you're just buying packs of seats and you're not using Slack, then yeah, in some real way you shouldn't pay for it. And so I do think that as the tools exist, tools like Orb, it will enable companies to better align value to their monetization model. And I think in some cases that will mean the products have to get better, like you can't have shelfware. And in some cases, I think that will mean you'll be better able to capture existing value you're already providing. Right. And what that means for any company or even any industry, I think will differ. And we've seen lots of shifts. Another good example is there's a few companies now in the AI space, like Intercom, I believe, is still doing this. They're now transitioning to we will charge you only when the ticket resolves, right? So instead of charging you for AI queries or something, we're going to charge you when there's a successful support resolution. And again, I think jury's still out on whether those are totally going to work, but it is interesting because I think it allows you to look forward at what is the actual value? Does this make sense from a cost and margin perspective? And really try to like move and iterate quickly towards the right metric.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think like aligning your product with value that your customer is receiving has historically been pretty hard. Everybody uses proxies for this, right? And
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
with a lot of this usage-based billing, a lot of this consumption-based billing, it enables it a little bit more. And our personal story at Anvil is that we only charge when e-signature packets are completed, which
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
different from most players in the industry, where it's like
Mm-hmm.
whenever e-signature packets are created. And
Yeah.
so that's something that we believe heavily in as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
this just can apply to so many industries. Imagine if the medical industry was outcomes-based billing. Maybe Orb will be powering medical billing soon. We'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe let's transition a little bit into the meat of today's conversation, which is
Mm-hmm.
really trying to explore a time when you had to really decide between building versus buying, and maybe because of your unique position at starting Orb, we can talk about a little bit how that plays into how you think about Orb, right? Like I think
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty clear that Orb is a buy opportunity, right? If we
Yeah.
bought Orb to do billing for Ammo, we wouldn't have to have engineers
Yeah.
focus on billing. But yeah, so we'd love to also talk a little bit about how that plays into your thinking around usage-based pricing and buying a solution for it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because my sense is there's a class of things everyone buys without even thinking about it. AWS, right? No one, maybe not no one, but it's very rare now to build your own database. Like you go to RDS or Neon or any of these kind of Postgres, MySQL providers, and there's I think some clear things in the infrastructure space where almost everyone is buying, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think as I'm sure you've talked with other folks about, there's a little bit more nuance when it comes to other vendors outside of infrastructure where it's not so clear. My thinking around this is there's a couple proxies. I think one is that space regulated and is there some like real kind of hard complexity there? So I think one good example, which is not Orb, is like payments, right? You don't want to be storing credit card holder data. You don't want to sign yourself up for PCI compliance unless you really need to, and so you should buy that. And I think another example is if you're buying security software. I think in a lot of cases, I think there's a lot of value to doing that because there's some real hard complexity that you might not have expertise in and you want to outsource that to a different software vendor. One decision that we made, which is outside of those two criteria, is, for example, we use a vendor in order to export Orb data for our customers to their warehouse. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting case because we could have certainly built that ourselves for Snowflake and Redshift, but the number of data warehouses is increasing. We don't want to build more and more of those connectors. We don't want to have to think about the observability around that. And so I characterize that as these like N+1 problems where tools that you can buy that prevent you from a linear investment can be really powerful. And so these integrations tools more broadly, but in our case specifically, this tool around data exports has been really valuable for us. And then going to the second part of your question on how we think about this for Orb, yeah, I think as you said, billing is not the sort of thing that you want your team working on, but there's some real hesitation sometimes because it is very core to your business, right? It is, you don't want to adopt a billing vendor as a short term, hey, let's take this out of our roadmap, but then 6 months down the line or 9 months down the line, you're like, hey, I want to sell them this different way, and now I'm restricted by my billing vendor. So that is, I think, always a trade-off. The way we try to approach that is we build a bunch of extensibility into the product so that you're not blocked on a roadmap time. A good example of this is with usage-based billing, you have to write these effectively metrics that translate events to how you're measuring them. We just give you SQL to do that. And so we try to bake in the primitive such that we're minimizing the friction in the build versus buy decision, where the simplistic way to think about it is short-term roadmap time versus long-term flexibility. We try to give you both.
Got it. And that makes a lot of sense. I think pushing back to your previous statement about your integrator, you're building these data warehouse connectors versus buying. When you guys sat down to think about this problem space, one, why was exporting this data to a data warehouse important to your customer base? Maybe that's obvious, but I would love to just like explicitly call it out. And then two, what was the thought process in deciding whether to build these connectors yourself versus just, you touched on it a little bit, versus just using an existing solution out there?
Yeah, so the importance of data exports is basically a lot of this billing data you need to join to other data sources in order for you to conduct material analysis on it. You might want to join in data from your CRM or something and be looking at invoices by segment or subscription churn rates, right? Things like this that typically will happen in a data warehouse. So some of those workflows we can power in Orb. A lot of them you just need to conduct in, again, Snowflake, S3, Redshift. And yeah, to your point, I think when we were evaluating how do we think about this class of problem, I think one thing was, are we best qualified to work with the 10 or 11 different export solutions? And the answer was no, like we didn't use all of them in-house. And so we didn't want to go down that path of building for them. Yeah. And here there's some amount of like developer ergonomics, some amount of correctness, risk, right? Where if we just don't understand the interfaces well enough. And then I think there's also some amount of security risk where if we are not authenticating against these other export solutions in the most hygienic way, then we also don't want to keep that security risk on the table, right? So that was, I think, driving a lot of the decision making. And then I think when you go out and try to pick a vendor, our evaluation criteria really centered around, is this vendor built for companies like us, right? Are they powering similar use cases? Are they shipping similar amounts of data volume already? Are they trusted by other leading companies? So I think a lot of that was in the evaluation criteria. And then I think we always like working with companies that can move quickly. I think that is implicitly as a startup always a criteria because you're going to get requests from your customers. You want to be able to work with your vendors to satisfy them. And I think that's really important to us.
Yeah, that's an interesting point right there because in some ways, moving quickly for you as a startup that's deciding to buy a software solution could mean that you're going to go out and find the most complete solution out there.
Yeah.
So another example, maybe you choose Salesforce because Salesforce has so much flexibility and there's so many existing design patterns, solutions, developer ecosystem that has been established for using Salesforce instead of another CRM. But the other way to think about it is really, okay, what is the responsiveness of this team that we're going to be working on? How large are they? Are we a design partner with them that they're willing to like take our feedback and really build against that? Or are they going to be, are they just not going to have enough resources to actually help us achieve our kind of goals and milestones? So I feel like there's lots of ways to think about that. Are there? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one way to think about that is like, you try to figure out how unique is your pain point and how cutting edge are you, so to speak, right? Yeah, that's one thing we think about with billing, which is the pain point in billing has to be large enough for someone to consider working with someone that's not a really large, like Zuora-like vendor, right? And the market opportunity for Orb exists because those incumbent solutions just they don't support the needs. If they did, I think it would be a really hard market to enter. Yeah, I think about it like if your needs are so similar to what's been required for the last 10 years, then it's hard to justify going with a startup even if they move marginally faster. Right?
Interesting. Yeah, and I think like in a lot of ways, Orb's positioning is geared towards, it sounds like engineering and product teams.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I think of the Zoras of the world, it's more geared towards finance teams and operations teams. So there's a different level of integration that's happening here
Yeah.
that you guys are serving. You're serving at a
Yeah.
like, more root level, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like we end up integrating initially with engineering and product, and then over time we spend a lot of time with finance and accounting. But you're right. I think this is coupled with this sort of consumption-based billing shift where
Mhm.
product and engineering teams just have to think about this problem a lot more. Whereas if you're in a contracted seat-based business, finance can handle a lot of the integration work.
And so maybe like when you were thinking about these like connection pipe integrators to these data warehouses, who was the end customer in mind when you were thinking about this? I mean, it feels like the goal there is really to enable a lot of the finance people or the operations people to
Yeah.
do their work, to do the day-to-day finance stuff that needs to happen on
Yeah.
top of the data that you guys are generating.
Yeah, it varies a little bit, but it's typically a combination of data teams, finance teams, and kind of business operations teams. The reason I say it varies is because the ability for finance to work on top of the data warehouse, I still think looks pretty different across companies. I think some companies, they've set up really good self-serve tooling for that. Some companies, what gets shipped to the data warehouse is still fairly siloed off, right? That's one difference where in some cases you need a data intermediary, and in other cases that's not required.
Do you guys think of yourself, or specifically, as the source of a lot of this data? Obviously, the application itself is the source of the data, but
Yeah.
and then you think of yourself as the next step in this source of data, or I know we've worked with a lot of companies where they've effectively used like a snowflake as a data miner.
Yeah.
They would put all their data in there, and then they push it out to all the places that
Yeah.
they wanted it. Is there a model
Yeah.
for Orb to consume data from a data warehouse?
Yeah. So that we do consume data from data warehouses in the sense that product usage data gets shipped to Orb. We need you to send us some sort of usage events, and this can be at really high volume, but that is a required input. I think that the way that I would frame it is Orb is the thing that connects that product usage to revenue. And
Okay.
so a lot of what we're exporting is like saying, okay, here was your quantity for this subscription for this day. And that maybe you could just work out in your warehouse, but then we'll also tell you, given the contract details, here's how much revenue you should recognize, and here's how much it costs your customer. And that sort of data is being genuinely produced by Orb. So, yeah, I would think of it as enriching usage data in some ways, but to be honest with you, a lot of companies we work with just don't even have the level of usage visibility. It's not like that's already there and they're just looking for the final dollar amount. I think in some cases, or maybe a lot of cases, we are the first step to providing cross-functional visibility into, hey, are my customers hitting overages? Are they burning down their credits faster than they should? Even those basic, just quantity-related questions.
Man, you're really selling me to buy Orb right now. That's super helpful. I think like when you were going back to connectors again, just
Yeah.
hitting home on this build versus buy decision, were there internal advocates for building these connectors yourself? Was there an argument to be made there?
Yeah, I think I don't know if there was an advocate for building all of them, but I think there was some push. Hey, we should build one connector to understand what is it that we care about, what are customers going to ask for, what is the like medium term roadmap, like almost as a discovery process. We ended up not doing that because, in fact, the vendor we work with gave us a lot of confidence that they had thought deeply about the problem. But I do think that's something that is valuable in general, which is trying to understand how should I be evaluating a vendor? And sometimes that involves building, right? Sometimes that involves getting it wrong or hitting a roadblock or sketching out the shape of solution before you go out and run a vendor evaluation. And obviously, as you go up market, you'll see this a lot where as a vendor, you get sent RFPs. And RFPs are basically that, like they've done some building or a significant amount of discovery, and they have a ton of criteria that they're looking for already. I think sometimes startups make the mistake of, I want to solve problem X, and that's all they know. And then it's very hard to pick what is the right vendor for me.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting point, and probably it's a very critical part of the build versus buy decision, which is how do you evaluate a vendor? And I feel like you're probably the first guest to touch on this. So I would love to just take a diversion here and talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. Specifically, how did you gain enough confidence in this vendor? And feel free to name the vendor as well if you feel
Yeah.
comfortable. How did you feel? How did you gain such confidence in this vendor to know that they were the right solution to power this pretty critical part of your business?
Yeah, so the vendor's Prequel, they do what I said. They power data exports. I think, and maybe I'll zoom out to just generally how we think about vendor evaluations. I think a large part of it, as I was saying, is understanding who they're built for, which audience they talk to, like how technical their team is, right? Like really trying to understand, are we the right shape of company, stage of company for this vendor? Are they used to working with companies of our size? And maybe not even just size, but like level of technical support we might need or not need. I think the other part of it is we, as I think most startups are, tend to be pretty hands-on in vendor evaluations. Like in fact, we do this quite a bit. We have some vendors on the streaming side that we use for data aggregation, and we want those people to come into our office to give a demo, to meet the team, to really build internal advocacy around the vendor. I think one thing I care a lot about is in my seat, it's easy to say, okay, we're going with this vendor, and hey, infra team,
Yeah,
go deploy it. And
yeah,
realistically, that's I don't think a great way to work. And so, another part of the vendor evaluation process is having them really either demo and show the product super concretely for our use case, or being able to get into a sandbox and for us to be able to play around with it and really build that technical confidence on the ground with the ICs who are going to be working on the vendor day to day. This is honestly why Orb, if you go to our static site, there's like a demo sandbox because people who are evaluating build versus buy for us, they want to be able to like look at the product without talking to sales, and then maybe once they're ready, they'll engage in a commercial process. But we just believe that's the better way to buy.
yeah. No, that's almost a prerequisite if you're selling to developers, right? Like developers
Yeah,
do not want to talk to people, generally speaking. And I think we've experienced this ourselves, which is a lot of times by the time we're on a call with a potential prospect, it's oftentimes a product manager with the developer on the call, and the
yeah,
developer has already read through our docs, already played around,
yeah,
already made some API requests, and so the
yeah.
sandbox, it feels like a prerequisite to selling any kind of this developer centric, product centric kind of product. Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the other maybe sometimes I feel like there's this binary distinction between are you a product led growth company where people need a sandbox out of the box, or are you like a sales led company? I think in reality there's a big spectrum there, and so for example, Orb is not a developer tool. Like no developer wakes up and is like, hey, I'm going to revamp our billing. Right? So it's like an executive level decision. Someone says, hey, this is breaking at the seams. We need a developer to go evaluate Orb. And so this is a case where the developer is championing and enabling the product, but ultimately they're not going to be the ones who just go in. It is still a very cross-functional sale. So I think even in those scenarios, really fast access to product, really obvious time, fast time to value can be very helpful.
Yeah, no, I totally hear that. I feel like no one developer is really deciding to pick Orb over another vendor.
Yeah.
It's almost you almost always have to have buy-in from the top. So it's like bottoms up PLG with like top down sales led to really
Yeah.
find the middle. This make this decision
Yeah.
happen.
Like
Uh,
some people, I think the term is like product assisted sales or something, but yeah, exactly.
we love buckets. We love putting different go-to-market motions into buckets here. Maybe there's some kind of usage-based bucketing for go-to-market motions.
Exactly.
um, cool. Well, I guess it sounds like one of the last questions we always have is, was that the right decision? Is this the thing that
Hmm.
you're happy that you went this direction with Prequel? And I think it's pretty obvious that you are happy. You guys
Yeah.
use them quite heavily and probably saved you guys a little bit of time in terms of just getting this feature out to customers. Would that be
Yeah.
accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that's definitely accurate. It saved us a lot of time. The cases where I would say the decision has been harder or we've backtracked are cases where we have realized our requirements are just a lot more specialized than we thought, or there needs to be a much deeper integration into our data model. I think those are cases where we've had to, effectively bring it back in house, and even there, I think it hasn't been obvious to me that trying to go with a vendor was the wrong call, right? I think this is just the sort of thing where a lot of these decisions are genuinely reversible. Some you have to be more careful about, but I suspect that most companies will go through the build and buy cycle many times, even just for a specific piece of their stack. And that seems natural.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Maybe to wrap up a little bit here, we always like to ask, what are you excited to be working on, both personally and professionally? Pick something that
Hmm.
you're to share. And then the last question would be, what is something you recently purchased that you love
Hmm.
or you would not buy again? So yeah, those are the
Okay.
last two questions.
Yeah. Honestly, for Orb, I'm very excited about deepening our story with the finance team. We just talked a little bit about the data exports, but we had a launch a couple months ago around in product recognized revenue, billings, unbilled revenue, like these things that sound very technical, but honestly are very hard when you move from a subscription or seat based business to a usage based business. So we're starting to see things like ARR and NDR. These like NDR is an interesting example because it matters. Like expansion revenue matters a lot for these usage based businesses. I'm
Yeah.
excited to see that make its way natively into the product, make more accessible than having to do it on top of a data warehouse. And then on the personal level, something I bought recently, I recently got a iPad Pro, and it's interesting because I've had an iPad for a while, but it was a really old iPad, and with the iPad Pro and the pencil, I'm using it a lot more. So it's just been surprising that it's the same form factor, a lot of ways the same tool, but performance maybe it's that's an interesting example of like performance and accessibility making a real difference to like how much I actually end up using it.
Yeah. Did you have a pencil before with your
I
previous
did
account?
not.
Yeah.
No, I didn't.
I feel like
So
that's a big. It's funny. It's like going backwards in terms of design and like how you interact with this new digital device.
yeah,
But every time I see somebody typing on an iPad, it is the most painful thing ever. It's always like you
exactly.
can't use your thumbs. You're like
Yeah,
pecking. You have to put it on the table. So that pencil, funny enough, form factor does make it more easy to use. Um,
agreed. Yeah,
Cool for coming on the show today. I had a great time speaking with you. Learned a lot about Orb. I learned a lot about usage-based billing. Should have talked to you guys before we started implementing our usage-based billing, but I had a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on.
great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.